What was the best video game console to own in 1995? There have been some great games that have come out prior on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, but if you had to choose one console in the year 1995 with just the games that came out that year, what's the best one to choose? So, what's going on in 1995? The 16-bit era is coming to an end. You've got the Super Nintendo in one corner, you've got the Sega Genesis in the other. It's the final round of the match. Things have gotten ugly, and just when you think the dust is going to be settled, PlayStation arrived in 1995 in Japan and North America. No, just North America. And it had 3D graphics for the masses. There were some other consoles, but they don't matter. They're not important. Oh yeah, and the Sega Saturn came out too. Let's start by looking at the Sega Genesis. It does what Nintendo don't. It wore sunglasses. Its parents probably let it see an R-rated movie once. It's probably even talked to a girl. The Genesis had given Nintendo a huge run for their money this generation, so let's see what they put up in their final hours. I don't know these games. I think upon first inspection of these bigger releases for the Sega Genesis in 1995, it may seem a little unfamiliar. Taking a look at some of these games though, they've got some really cool ideas or concepts. These games look really interesting. I think if you're not part of that big Sega Genesis fanboy club, they may seem unfamiliar. So I think it's a pretty solid and pretty fair year for Sega Genesis. Was it Crusader of Senti? Kenti? No. And I'm realizing I forgot to add the 32X in the Sega CD. I hate those things. Have you ever tried to make the Tower of Power? I have. It sucks. It was a stupid idea, and you can fight me on that. And yeah, I mean, you got Virtua Fighter. Okay, that's not bad. Virtua Fighter and Snatcher. So let's take a look at the Super Nintendo.
Ooh, they're so awesome!
That's some stiff competition. I did not realize how strong 1995 was for Nintendo. You just say these names of these titles around some Nintendo fanboys and they'll just like froth at the mouth. Now, while this is a strong year for the Super Nintendo, can the industry-changing wave that was PlayStation take the cake for 1995? You know, it's a cliche observation, but it really must have been just incredible to go from 16-bit graphics to just 3D craziness. I mean, really just take a moment to appreciate that the novelty of a game like Jumping Flash. It's not that great of a game, but it just conceptually would get people excited enough to spend money on it. I would be hyped to have Tekken on my PS1. Twisted Metal, Wipeout. Wipeout came out in 1995. F-Zero X hadn't come. You gotta wait 3 more years for F-Zero X. Wow. And I mean, there's a lot of other stuff going on in here too.
It's Ridge Racer! Ridge Racer!
It's not the height of PlayStation.
Time to teach someone some manners.
I take that back. Now let's rank these systems from to must-have. What's that? The imaginary person behind me told me that I forgot about the Sega Saturn. It is me from the future, or if you're watching this, the past, because that's how filming works. I am a big idiot, and this is a lesson in double-checking your sources online. I had the wrong games listed for the Sega Saturn, hence I am re-recording supporting this part. The Sega Saturn in 1995, you can understand why people bought a Sega Saturn. There are some really good games. Virtua Fighter, I think the actual Virtua Fighters, the ones that were actually in 3D, I think the 32X that Virtua Fighter was also in 3D as well. They really split up too much of their hardware between Sega Rally, Daytona, USA, Panzer Dragoon, also Bug. So it's actually a pretty solid lineup. I think there's some really cool games in here. In its first year, there is a battle between the Saturn and the PlayStation happening, especially with like fighters. You've got Virtua Fighter firmly in the Sega Saturn camp, and then you've got Tekken over at PlayStation. Solid things from the Sega Saturn. Let's finally rank these systems from meh to gotta have for 1995. Fourth place, I'm gonna give it to the Sega Genesis. It's a really good lineup. There's some cool games in here. The Senti, what is it? I can't ever remember the damn name. Century of Senti? Whatever that game is. It looks like an interesting Zelda clone. Phantasy Star, Final Fantasy-esque. The dude, Shining Force, whatever it was, they all looked cool. The one with that cool anime intro, the comic book one, Comic Zone. Like, there really are some cool games to look at on Sega Genesis. It's fourth place, but honestly, I think it's solid. Coming in at third place, I'm going to give it to, it's actually the Sega Saturn. Its launch, there's some really good games. If you picked up a Sega Saturn, there's stuff to play. You've got Panzer Dragoon, which is probably maybe the most well-known Sega Saturn game, the most sought-after Sega Saturn game. Things, again, that like entering the 3D era were exciting, were fresh, and maybe even if the games lacked a bit of depth that maybe games in the 16-bit era were offering, the newness of 3D, the novelty of the concept, it's got you locked in. Second place, I'm gonna give it to PlayStation. Honestly, I feel like it's fairly even between the Saturn and the PlayStation. Besides two factors, the price point and a bit more third-party support on Sony's side. There's some really solid games on the Sega Saturn. But on PlayStation, you have Tekken. You have some series that are about to start up that are just legendary for that generation and beyond. It's just edges over a bit for me, and it's kind of the same thing with the Sega Saturn. This isn't the height of PlayStation, and yet it's that tantalizing view into what's to come. I'm putting PlayStation in the number 2 spot. Because why wouldn't I? Number 1, if you have terrible power of deduction, goes to the Super Nintendo. For a final full year before the Nintendo 64, there's just some bangers here. There are games here, maybe not all of them are in greatest of all time contention, but are at least for Nintendo greatest of all time. A Chrono Trigger alone, for most people, I think they haven't stopped playing it since 1995. I think that's the only game they play. Stop playing it. It's a spreadsheet. I don't like JRPGs, but I do respect games that other people, like that I maybe don't. I should give Chrono Trigger another try. There you have it. The year 1995. I wasn't even born yet, but it's actually surprisingly a really solid year for games. I wanted to start with 1995 because I think before that it's pretty easy to determine what console you should own. You've got a few years where it's Genesis versus Super Nintendo, but then before that, it's just kind of like, you either own the Nintendo or the Atari. And also, it's getting so granular at that point with games that maybe aren't as exciting as they used to be. So, starting with 1995, I thought it was interesting because you also have a cross-generational point occurring. So, anyways, do you agree with this list? It's okay if you don't. That's what the comments are for, so we can have a toxic conversation. I personally would have preferred the lineup of the PlayStation over the Super Nintendo, but that's just my personal taste. I think looking a bit objectively, the Super Nintendo would have been the best console to own in 1995, though I would rather go some rounds in Twisted Metal with some friends and Tekken, because Tekken's freaking Tekken. Let me know what you think. Happy to be back. This is my first YouTube video in like 15 years. Hope to be doing more, and I'll see y'all in 1996. Au revoir.